The boardroom was cold that morning, not because of the temperature, but because of the silence waiting to see what the new CEO would do with the oldest person in the building. I had taken my usual seat, the one I had used for years whenever I presented new architecture reviews, but this time no one looked at me as a partner. They glanced at me the way people glance at furniture they plan to replace. Phones were lowered. Eyes shifted. A strange excitement floated around the table, a quiet expectation that someone was about to be humiliated. She walked in, confident and impatient, with the kind of smile that tells a room she already knows who is useful and who is not. She had arrived only 2 weeks earlier, parachuted in by investors who believed energy alone could replace experience. She introduced herself again as if repetition created authority. She talked about speed, disruption, reinvention, and the future. She talked about the need to upgrade every corner of the company. Then she looked directly at me. Her eyes held a carefully curated sympathy, the type that prepares an audience for something painful. She said the words slowly, as if she wanted the echo to land before the meaning did. She called me a legacy drag. The room stiffened. Several people pressed their lips together to hide reactions. Someone coughed softly. No one looked at me directly. It was the kind of label that attempts to rewrite years of contribution into a single moment of dismissal. I felt the weight of it settle over my shoulders, not because it was true, but because everyone else accepted it without question. Before I could even process the insult, she followed with her decision. She announced that I would be demoted to intern. The phrase felt almost unreal. An intern is someone learning the basics. An intern is someone discovering the field. An intern is someone who has not spent years designing the foundation that keeps the entire company running. None of that mattered to her. She had decided the narrative, and the room adjusted itself around her decision. I did not speak. My silence surprised her. She paused, expecting an argument, a protest, maybe even anger. She did not understand that some of us learned long ago that dignity does not require noise. I simply listened. She continued talking about the importance of refreshing the team and removing outdated habits. She described a new structure that placed her own recruits in strategic positions. She presented it as progress. The board nodded with enthusiasm, eager to support a leader who promised speed over stability. When she handed me the new identification badge with the word intern printed across the front, the gesture was performed like a symbolic cleansing. She believed she was returning the company to youth. She believed she was removing the one person who represented the past. She believed that stripping my title erased the depth of what I had built. She believed a badge could rewrite ownership. I placed the badge in my pocket without emotion. My colleagues avoided my eyes as if contact might transfer my misfortune to them. The new CEO smiled again, satisfied that she had reshaped the hierarchy in a single move. She dismissed the room with confidence, certain that her decision had closed a chapter. As I stood up and walked out, she watched me with the expression of someone who thinks she has already won. In her mind, I no longer existed as a force. She believed she had erased me. I walked out of the boardroom carrying the intern badge she believed defined my new identity, yet the real weight I carried was something no one in that room had taken the time to examine. The decision to demote me had been made quickly, almost theatrically, but the speed of it revealed something far more important. She had acted without asking the questions every experienced leader learns to ask before touching anything tied to the roots of a company. The silence she kept around those questions told me everything I needed to know. She never reviewed the original contracts that described the structure of ownership during the early years of the company. Those documents were written in long nights when the business had no revenue and few employees, when every partner insisted on protective clauses because we had no certainty of survival. She never looked at the licensing terms that had allowed the company to use my work instead of purchasing it outright. She never asked why I had never moved the rights into the company the way others had. She walked past these details as if history had no value. She never requested an audit of intellectual property. She never asked the legal team to investigate who had contributed what, who held what, and under which terms the technology existed. She never reviewed the early repositories that showed the origin of the architecture she now marketed as cutting edge. She never questioned why the earliest commits carried a unique structure and why security updates still relied on methods I alone maintained. Her confidence was built on the assumption that everything inside the building belonged to her. She also never requested a handoff. A real transition always involves documentation, explanations, and a slow understanding of what holds a system together. She skipped all of it. She believed she could replace experience with enthusiasm, and she believed that new hires with polished resumes could understand the deepest layers of a system created long before they graduated. She handed out new titles, reorganized teams, and built a strategy without touching the very foundation she promoted during investor calls. The board supported her because the numbers were rising. They liked her energy. They liked her decisiveness. They liked the idea of modernization. They did not realize modernization becomes dangerous when people remove parts they never learned to identify. They did not recognize the quiet shift in the room when she announced my demotion. They saw only a symbolic reshaping of hierarchy. They did not see the absence of due diligence that every seasoned professional recognizes instantly. As I walked through the hallway, employees avoided my eyes. They whispered about the change, imagining this was a story about age, relevance, and new leadership. They did not know that none of the necessary steps had been taken to secure the foundation they relied on. They did not know what documents remained in my possession. They did not know which elements of the technology required renewal of rights every year. They did not know that the entire infrastructure still functioned on a license that had never been transferred. I reached my old office and found a junior employee already measuring the walls for new equipment. She smiled politely, unaware of the history embedded in the furniture she was preparing to replace. I stepped aside without saying anything. Authority no longer required a rune. My leverage lived elsewhere. I placed the intern badge on the desk and looked at it for a long moment. Nothing about this change threatened what I owned. The real risk was hers, not mine. She had made her decision without asking the questions that protect leaders from themselves. Experience does not argue. It waits. When the company first opened its doors, we worked out of a single room with borrowed furniture and a server that overheated every afternoon. There were no titles then, only responsibilities that shifted from hour to hour. I remember choosing the corner seat near the window because the light helped me stay awake during the long nights spent writing code that would eventually become the spine of the entire operation. While others debated branding, culture, and future leadership, I focused on stability. I believed a company survives only when its foundations are strong. Names did not matter at that stage. Function did. As the years passed and the team grew, people began fighting for recognition. They argued about whose idea shaped which feature. They competed for the spotlight during investor visits. They wanted their pictures on the website and their titles printed on conference badges. I never joined those conversations. My contribution was never meant to be displayed. I wanted the architecture to speak for itself. Stability became my signature, even when no one knew it belonged to me. Some thought I lacked ambition. Others believed I preferred the background. The truth was simpler. I trusted the long game more than any visible reward. I never put my name on the wall because public credit fades quickly. A new product distracts people. A new executive shifts the narrative. A new crisis erases yesterday's applause. Quiet work, on the other hand, becomes permanent. Every function I built connected to something deeper inside the system. Every improvement shaped the reliability clients praised. Every tool I created allowed others to succeed without understanding how they succeeded. The company grew because the invisible parts held everything together. My reluctance to chase titles was not humility. It was strategy. Titles can be taken away. Influence cannot. By focusing on systems instead of visibility, I made myself essential without appearing irreplaceable. That was intentional. I wanted freedom to build without the distraction of politics. I wanted the technology to evolve naturally, not through committee debates. I wanted the team to rely on the structure more than the person behind it. That allowed the product to stay consistent even when leadership changed repeatedly. People often asked why I stayed quiet during meetings, why I did not push my ideas more aggressively, why I avoided the spotlight when the company celebrated major milestones. I understood something they did not. Leadership tends to overlook the person who performs without demanding attention. That oversight created space. Through that space, I shaped the direction of the company in ways no announcement could capture. My influence came from design, not discussion. It came from building the skeleton others trusted without knowing they trusted it. When new employees joined, they learned the system through documentation I had written over time. They relied on tools I had created years earlier. They fixed bugs with methods I had embedded into the architecture. They never asked who had put those elements in place because everything felt natural. That was the goal. I wanted the company to function even if no one noticed the hands that built its core. I wanted the product to feel inevitable. I understood long before the new CEO arrived that visibility invites conflict. People protect the visible. They undermine it. They compete with it. But no one fights the quiet architect. No one prepares for the person they believe has no interest in power. I chose that path deliberately. It gave me a freedom the leadership never recognized until it was too late. I never needed my name displayed to prove my worth. The system itself carried my imprint in every line, every protocol, every safeguard. That imprint held everything together even as titles shifted and narratives changed. The strongest leverage is invisible until pulled. The morning after my demotion, I walked into the building wearing the badge she had handed me, the one that publicly labeled me as the lowest person in the hierarchy. People barely noticed me. Some nodded quickly with awkward sympathy. Others looked away, unsure if they should acknowledge me at all. What none of them understood was that the new title had removed every layer of expectation that once surrounded my name. I was no longer seen as a decision maker or an architect. I had become invisible, and invisibility has its own strange form of freedom. The first surprise came when I logged into the internal system. My old credentials had been deactivated, but the new intern access included broad permissions she had never reviewed. Interns worked across multiple departments during onboarding, so the company gave them temporary entry into documentation portals. The assumption was that interns needed exposure to learn. The oversight was simple. No one had considered what an intern with deep historical knowledge might do with those doors left open. I visited the documentation hub first. It had been reorganized by people who believed a new folder structure erased all traces of the past. They had never bothered to clean the archives. The earliest documents remained untouched, including original design decisions, dependency maps, and licensing notes. I scrolled through each section slowly, recognizing my own language in every paragraph. Nothing had been updated. Nothing had been transferred. Everything remained exactly as it had been when we lacked staff to rewrite anything and relied entirely on my structure to keep the product alive. The second discovery came when I accessed the old repositories. Most interns only glanced at them out of curiosity, but for me they were familiar territory. The early commits carried timestamps from the nights when we worked until sunrise. My notes were still attached to the most complex sections. The version history revealed how the system had evolved, yet the core architecture remained untouched. New features had been layered on top of the original engine, but no one had ever replaced that engine. It was still mine, and the licensing agreement that governed it remained part of the repository metadata. I found the archived clauses soon after. They were stored in a legal folder most people never opened, partly because the company believed everything important had been moved to more polished platforms. These clauses were handwritten agreements scanned during our first year when we could not afford formal counsel. They outlined the terms of use for the technology one created. They confirmed that ownership never transferred. They confirmed that the license required renewal. They confirmed that the company had never obtained permanent rights. Those pages had been ignored for years, preserved only through digital habit. The irony was impossible to ignore. As an executive, I often faced locked doors, restricted access, and approval workflows created by people who did not understand the systems they were protecting. As an intern, I walked through those same doors without question. No one monitored me. No one asked what I was reviewing. No one imagined that a demoted employee might be the only person capable of understanding the very foundation they believed they owned. I sat quietly in a corner desk that afternoon, surrounded by younger staff who whispered about project deadlines and office politics. They did not notice that I had open files older than most of their careers. They did not realize I was reading the history of the company in its rawest form. They assumed I was adapting to a lesser role. They assumed the badge had stripped me of influence. In reality, the badge had returned me to the beginning, where everything was clear and every line of code still carried the truth of its origin. It gave me the access I had once needed to build the company and now needed to understand how it would fall. They gave you a badge, not realizing it opened history. The deeper I went into the archives, the more I realized how much of the company's confidence rested on assumptions instead of facts. People believed the technology belonged entirely to the organization because it had grown so large around it. They forgot that large trees can grow from branches that were never theirs to begin with. The early documents revealed something the new leadership had never bothered to examine. A small group of us had crafted the licensing terms in the earliest stage of our survival when we needed protection more than structure. At that time, I had insisted on writing the first version of the agreement myself. I remember the night we created it. We were working from a rented room above a cafe that closed too early for our schedules. The team was exhausted, the future uncertain, and the financial risk unbearable. We had built a fragile product that attracted interest, but not stability. No one knew whether investors would stay or disappear the next day. To protect our contributions, I drafted a clause that defined ownership in a way that ensured no one could strip authority from the people who built the engine. I did not expect it to be used one day against the very company I helped create, but I crafted it for a moment when power might shift unfairly. The licensing structure was simple. The intellectual property did not transfer to the company. Instead, the company received renewable access to use the technology under specific conditions. Those conditions required annual review, written confirmation of compliance, and shared authority over major updates. Only a handful of leaders understood those terms. Most of them had left years earlier. The clause survived inside a forgotten folder, untouched because no one imagined it still mattered. They assumed history fades when people stopped talking about it. They were wrong. Ownership stayed with me because the original commitment was built on trust, not hierarchy. At the beginning, I did not want to bind the team to investors who could change direction without understanding the technology. I wanted to protect the work until we reached stability. Those early years were chaotic. Promises shifted weekly. Funding vanished and reappeared unpredictably. People came and left with little explanation. The clause ensured that the code could not be sold, restructured, or claimed without approval from the contributors. It was a safeguard created out of necessity, not ego. Usage was conditional because we needed control in order to innovate. If the company ever diverted from the intended purpose, failed to maintain security standards, or attempted to separate the architecture from its original design principles, the license could be suspended. It was a delicate balance between allowing growth and preventing misuse. At the time, no one questioned the terms. Everyone was grateful for protection. No one imagined a future leader who would attempt to erase the people who built the very thing she relied upon. As I reread the clause in the archives, I realized the new CEO had never seen it. Her decisions were made too quickly to include a legal review. Her confidence came from visible authority, not historical understanding. She believed title defined ownership. She believed dismissal erased contribution. She believed control came from position, not structure. She never considered that the foundation she stood on required permission to function. I leaned back in my chair that afternoon and felt a calm settle over me. There was no need to argue. There was no need to confront anyone. The truth did not require volume. All I needed was to follow the process written years ago in a moment of caution and clarity. The company did not own its future. It borrowed it. In the weeks that followed, I watched the company expand with an energy that felt more theatrical than strategic. The new CEO moved quickly, announcing bold goals in every department and presenting herself as a visionary who could reshape the future with a single meeting. Investors loved the performance. They applauded her confidence, her ambition, and her promise of rapid transformation. They believed she had inherited a stable platform and could accelerate growth by sheer force of personality. They never questioned what supported that platform or who created the systems she relied upon in every presentation. I observed everything quietly from my new desk, a place far removed from leadership circles, yet close enough to see how decisions were being made. The CEO held weekly updates filled with polished slides, bright colors, and impressive projections. She spoke about efficiency gains, market penetration, and plans to dominate sectors we had only cautiously explored. Her words carried enthusiasm, but the engine powering those projections was older than her entire career. Every milestone she celebrated was rooted in work written long before she arrived. The team moved quickly to implement her ideas. They added layers of functionality on top of the architecture I had built. They introduced features that created excitement among early adopters. They celebrated technical achievements with gatherings that filled the hallways with noise. I sat among interns reviewing documentation that still carried my notes from years earlier. Every time a new feature succeeded, it did so because it drew strength from the underlying structure. Every improvement they announced depended entirely on the code I had designed during nights when the company barely had enough money to stay open. Investors visited the office with growing enthusiasm. They praised the CEO for her leadership and praised the product for its flexibility. They marveled at how quickly the company seemed to innovate. They complimented her for maintaining stability while pushing aggressive expansion. Yet none of them realized that stability came from design choices made long before she planned her first public statement. The silence surrounding the true origin of the system grew louder with every celebration. I noticed a pattern. Each time the CEO received praise, she leaned further into the illusion that she was shaping the future alone. She encouraged teams to adopt new workflows without understanding the risks. She pushed developers to build faster without examining the deeper layers that made such speed possible. She believed growth was a result of direction rather than foundation. She never paused to consider how fragile success becomes when it depends on something borrowed. The product continued to rise. User numbers increased. Articles appeared praising the company for innovation. Industry conferences invited the CEO to speak about disruption and reinvention. She accepted with pride, convinced that her vision was propelling the company beyond its competitors. No one asked how the system supported a surge in usage. No one asked why performance remained stable during expansion. No one asked who had shaped the architecture that allowed the company to scale without collapse. I remained silent through all of it. There was no need to correct assumptions. Silence allowed the pattern to unfold naturally. I watched leaders take victory laps over achievements built entirely on foundations they never examined. I watched teams celebrate milestones without understanding that the core engine had remained unchanged for years. Every line of code that carried them forward carried my signature, hidden beneath new interfaces and modern jargon. The truth existed quietly beneath every success. Patience is easy when you understand the structure better than anyone in the room. I did not need recognition. I did not need acknowledgement. I simply observed the future forming around a misunderstanding. Time would reveal everything. Success built on borrowed ground always sinks. The company held a major strategy meeting 2 months after my demotion, a gathering so important that employees began preparing for it days in advance. People rehearsed presentations, polished graphs, and whispered about the arrival of new investors who were expected to reshape the future of the organization. I was not on the invitation list, but the walls of a company always carry sound when the stakes are high. Every corridor echoed with fragments of anticipation. Every desk hummed with hurried preparation. No one questioned my presence near the meeting rooms because an intern is invisible even in moments of transformation. When the doors closed behind the leadership group, I found a quiet spot in the hallway where I could observe without being noticed. I was not interested in participating. I wanted to understand the assumptions guiding their decisions. The meeting lasted hours. People stepped in and out with documents, laptops, and expressions filled with excitement. I caught glimpses of slides displaying aggressive growth curves and expansion timelines that suggested absolute confidence in the stability of the underlying technology. They had built an entire future on the belief that the foundation would hold, yet none of them had reviewed the terms that governed that foundation. Inside the room, the CEO spoke with conviction. Her voice carried through the hallway each time the door opened. She presented the platform as a fully owned asset, strong enough to support international expansion. She promised global reach within 2 years and new product lines that depended entirely on the architecture I created. She described the system as proprietary technology acquired by the company during its early years, a claim that drew enthusiastic nods from potential investors. None of them knew that acquisition never occurred. None of them knew that the rights remained unchanged. Funding discussions followed. I heard applause at one point, suggesting a major commitment. Investors praised the CEO for her bold vision. They admired her assertiveness and her ability to inspire teams. They believed they were backing a company with a secure technical future. The irony drifted through the air like a quiet reminder that assumptions are dangerous when built on incomplete understanding. The meeting continued with discussions about rapid hiring, new divisions, and major partnerships. Every plan relied on the same foundation. Every projection depended on the stability of the system they did not own. Meanwhile, the technical team was instructed to prepare for increased demand. They reviewed capacity reports and began restructuring workflows for higher volume. They celebrated the recognition their work was receiving, unaware that the core engine enabling that growth was subject to agreements no one in leadership had read. They believed the company was entering a new era of dominance. They believed the architecture was secure because it had never failed. They believed success was guaranteed because momentum appeared unstoppable. As the hours passed, I realized something important. The deeper they committed to their vision, the stronger my position became. The more they built on my work, the more dependent their future became on a license they assumed existed in perpetuity. They were expanding confidently without realizing they were building on conditions rather than ownership. They were constructing a global strategy on technology that required permission for every major shift. When the meeting finally ended, the team spilled into the hallway with triumphant smiles. They spoke about record funding. They spoke about new markets. They spoke about the CEO's charisma and leadership. They spoke with the confidence of people who believed they had secured the future. I watched them celebrate, knowing something they had not yet learned. They were celebrating on a clock they did not control. The night before everything shifted was unusually quiet. The building had emptied hours earlier, leaving only the faint hum of servers and the distant vibration of machines running through automated tasks. I sat alone at the small intern desk they had assigned me, reviewing the licensing terms once more to ensure every detail remained aligned with the agreement drafted years earlier. Nothing had changed. The conditions were clear. The timeline was precise. The company had failed to meet the renewal requirements. The decision required no debate. It required a simple notification. I waited until the clock passed midnight. The silence allowed me to think without interruption. I did not feel anger. I did not feel vindicated. I felt a steady clarity, the kind that arrives after watching people build a future on mistaken beliefs. The leadership had moved forward confidently, speaking about expansion, dominance, and growth as if nothing could threaten their momentum. They had forgotten that technology is not loyal to enthusiasm. It follows structure, ownership, and agreements. They ignored those agreements, and the consequences were not personal. They were contractual. At 2 a.m, I reread the clauses that governed the license. The words brought back memories of the early team gathered around a single table, trying to protect themselves while hoping for survival. We had created a safeguard that felt excessive at the time, but proved necessary now. The company had inherited only the right to operate, not the engine itself. The leadership who dismissed me never examined that distinction. They believed rights came automatically with authority. They believed vision replaced obligation. They believed control was permanent simply because they desired it. I opened a new message window on the intern laptop, a device with minimal privileges, yet still capable of sending formal communications through the internal system. I addressed the email to the CEO, the legal department, and the board liaison. There was no need for additional recipients. The message needed to be delivered to those who believed they understood everything, yet overlooked the one detail that defined the future of the company. The quiet part of responsibility belonged to them now. I typed slowly, choosing each word with intention. The email contained no emotion. It did not reference my demotion. It did not mention the meetings I was excluded from. It did not acknowledge the celebrations built on incomplete assumptions. It simply stated that the license governing the use of the core technology would not renew due to failure to meet the annual compliance requirements. The wording came directly from the original document. I added the exact clause number and included a link to the archived file. There was no interpretation, only fact. At 4:12 in the morning, I looked at the message one final time. I considered how leadership would react when they opened it. Some would be confused. Others would be defensive. A few would assume it was an error. None of them could change its meaning. The conditions were outlined years earlier, validated by signatures they never bothered to revisit. The message did not signal a threat. It marked the moment when structure overtook ambition. I pressed send. The soft click felt almost insignificant, yet I knew it would travel through every layer of the organization once the sun rose. I closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the dim light, listening to the servers that depended on a license now set to expire. The building felt different, as if the walls themselves understood what would unfold when the leadership realized their oversight. There was no triumph in that moment, only certainty. I did not accuse. I informed. The email went out at 4:12 in the morning, and the silence that followed felt almost peaceful. I expected confusion, maybe disbelief, but I also knew the system moved in predictable waves. People in leadership rarely read emails before 9. Legal departments often begin with administrative tasks before turning to urgent matters. I went home, slept for a few hours, and returned the next day wearing the same intern badge they believed defined my new position. No one suspected anything had changed. The office moved with its usual energy, unaware that the ground beneath it had shifted. The first sign of disruption arrived shortly after noon. I noticed the legal team passing through the hallway with a speed that suggested more than routine work. They carried printed copies of something, whispering among themselves with expressions that revealed confusion mixed with rising concern. One of them glanced at me without recognition, as if I were part of the furniture. The irony of that moment lingered. They were holding documents I had written years earlier while walking past the person who crafted them. The call came at 2 in the afternoon. My intern phone vibrated with an internal number normally reserved for administrative reminders. When I answered, the voice on the other end introduced herself as corporate counsel. Her tone tried to strike a balance between politeness and authority. She asked whether I had time to clarify a few points regarding an email sent earlier. The phrasing was soft, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. I agreed, speaking with calm precision that made her slow down, as if she needed to adjust her expectations about the person she was addressing. She began with questions disguised as courtesy. She asked whether the notice had been sent in error. She asked whether I had intended to forward it to someone else. She asked whether I understood the implications of the message. Each question danced around the truth without confronting it. I answered each one with simple facts. The clause existed. The renewal requirements were clear. The company had missed every deadline. The license had entered termination automatically according to the document they had overlooked. Her tone shifted. Concern replaced courtesy. She asked why leadership had not been informed earlier. I reminded her that annual renewal was their responsibility, not mine. She asked why I had retained access to archived agreements. I reminded her that intern permissions included legacy folders by default. She asked whether I was aware of the scale of the company's current expansion. I reminded her that expansion had no bearing on ownership. She grew quiet for a moment, perhaps realizing that none of her questions altered the structure of the agreement. Then came the threats disguised as caution. She mentioned potential consequences for misuse of internal channels. She referenced the possibility of disciplinary review. She suggested that legal action might be required if the email caused reputational harm. I listened calmly, then repeated the clause number that defined the license. I explained that the notice was not an accusation, but a procedural step outlined years before. I reminded her that decisions made by leadership could not undo signed agreements. Her voice lost momentum as she realized the imbalance. She asked for time to review everything. I granted it without hesitation. There was no need to push. The documents were clear. The dates were immutable. The signatures were theirs. I returned the phone to my desk and watched the legal team gather again behind closed doors. Their conversation was no longer confident. It carried the rhythm of urgency mixed with disbelief. Hours passed as the company's excitement from the strategy meeting dissolved into confusion. Leadership tried to reach me through emails marked important. I responded with brief confirmations, nothing more. I moved slowly, deliberately, allowing the reality to settle into each department at its own pace. Urgency is loud when leverage is gone. After the lawyers called and the leadership realized the license could not be renewed through persuasion, pressure, or performance, a new phase began. Meetings intensified behind closed doors. Voices carried through the hallways with a sharper edge. The confidence that filled the office days earlier vanished under the weight of uncertainty. Yet I continued moving through the building like any other intern, unnoticed and unbothered, watching events unfold with a patience no one understood. They believed their crisis required my cooperation. They did not realize the agreement had already moved beyond conversation. The question of what I would do with the technology hung over the company like a silent storm. They assumed I intended to shut everything down. Some feared I wanted to watch the entire structure collapse. Others hoped I would reconsider for the sake of the team. Their assumptions revealed a simple truth. They never understood me. Destruction was never my goal. I had protected the architecture for years. I had shaped it into a tool capable of growth and transformation. It was not a weapon. It was a creation. It deserved to be used with respect, not arrogance. The decision to reposition the technology came quietly, without emotion or haste. I knew that companies often fail not because of weak ideas, but because of leadership that ignores the foundation supporting those ideas. My work did not deserve to sit beneath people who treated it as an accessory. It deserved a home where its value was recognized immediately. I reviewed several potential partners, studying their history, their priorities, and the way they treated the people behind the work. The choice became clear when I examined the competitor that had challenged our company for years. The rival firm had always focused on structure rather than showmanship. Their growth was slower but steadier. Their leadership spent more time studying technology than performing for investors. They respected documentation. They protected their engineers. They built systems through collaboration rather than domination. While our CEO chased attention, their team pursued understanding. While our office celebrated projections, their organization strengthened stability. The contrast made the decision almost effortless. I reached out discreetly through a former colleague who had joined the rival company years earlier. He understood the architecture at a deep level and recognized its uniqueness before I even explained the situation. Within hours, he arranged a confidential meeting with their technical director. When I presented the core engine, the director did not interrupt with excitement or questions. He studied the structure carefully, tracing the logic with the concentration of someone who understood the discipline behind each decision. His reaction said everything. He recognized the value not because it promised speed or spectacle, but because it carried the kind of resilience that comes from years of refinement. Copyright transfer, licensing continuity, and expansion opportunities were discussed with an attention to detail our own leadership had never shown. They asked how the architecture should evolve, not how it could be exploited for publicity. They asked what risks needed to be mitigated before integration, not how quickly it could be announced. Their respect was immediate and quiet, rooted in comprehension instead of excitement. For the first time in a long while, I felt that the work I had built would be handled with the care it required. The rival firm understood that innovation is fragile when divorced from its foundation. They understood that speed without structure is a temporary illusion. They understood the value of experience in a field that often rewards noise over knowledge. I chose them because they saw the architecture clearly. I chose them because they listened before deciding. I chose them because respect is not requested. It appears as recognition. Respect recognizes experience instantly. The first signs appeared early in the morning, long before the leadership team arrived. A few engineers noticed delays in the server logs, small irregularities that looked harmless at first glance. The pauses were brief, almost invisible, but they repeated with a rhythm that suggested something deeper than routine instability. They restarted a few processes, believing it was a temporary spike in activity. No one suspected anything unusual because the system had always recovered quickly. They trusted a stability they had never examined closely. By mid-morning, customer messages began filling the support channels. Features that had always responded instantly were suddenly taking long seconds to load. In some regions, the platform refused to authenticate new users. Videos did not process. Data did not sync. The CEO was preparing for a broadcast meant to celebrate recent funding when her assistant rushed in with reports of a widespread slowdown. She dismissed them at first, assuming the team could resolve everything quickly. She had always believed technology obeyed urgency. She had never watched a system respond to expired rights. The engineers worked with growing confusion. They searched for breaches, overloads, and infrastructure failures. Every test returned clean. Every diagnostic suggested the operations were normal. Yet the features continued to collapse one by one, like pieces of a structure losing support beneath the surface. Behind the scenes, the license that allowed the architecture to run had reached its termination window. The system did exactly what it had been designed to do when the agreement expired. It protected the integrity of the engine by reducing access, limiting functions, and slowing processes tied to restricted components. Within hours, customers voiced their frustration on social platforms. Major clients called their account managers demanding explanations. Investors sent urgent messages asking whether the company had been attacked. The CEO began pacing between meetings, trying to maintain control while the situation escalated faster than anyone could respond. Every solution proposed by the team required access to the core architecture. That access no longer existed. They were locked out of the very foundation they believed they owned. News outlets picked up the story before the end of the day. Competitors watched closely, waiting for signs that the company might recover or collapse. The leadership issued a brief announcement claiming the platform was experiencing temporary technical issues, but the message offered no clarity. It could not offer clarity because the truth was buried inside documents no one had reviewed. Their public confidence stood in sharp contrast to the growing panic inside the building. As the afternoon progressed, the blackout spread. Features that supported the company's largest clients stopped functioning entirely. Entire regions went offline without warning. The system no longer recognized requests that required licensed components. Customer dashboards froze. Automated tasks failed. Emergency protocols activated, but every pathway led back to the core engine. Without rights to operate it, the system behaved exactly as written in the clauses they had ignored. Inside the building, people whispered my name in confusion, speculation, and disbelief. No one mentioned me publicly. No one accused me directly. They could not, because the collapse was not caused by sabotage or a sudden strike. It was the natural consequence of contracts they never honored. The silence surrounding my role became louder with every hour of failure. They knew the architecture traced back to me, but they had never understood how much of the company depended on it. While their world descended into crisis, I was nowhere near the office. I sat quietly in a small cafe across town, reading messages forwarded by former colleagues, watching the story unfold without emotion. I had given the company years of stability. They had taken that for granted. Now the system spoke for itself. I was not in the building when it fell.